So that led to these 6 improvement principles that Lewis already mentioned. To be problem-focused and user-centered, attend to variability, see the system that creates that variability. We start to talk about improvement. You've got to embrace measurement and discipline inquiry and carry this all out through networks so we can accelerate learning to improve. And in my talk, I'm going to focus primarily on attending to variability. All right. Variation in performance as the problem to solve. My first bullet up there alludes to, I think the What Works Clearinghouse is misnamed. I think it should be called the What Can Work Clearinghouse, because that's what the evidence actually tells us. But if you're thinking about achieving what Lewis talked about in the first talk this morning about how do we get quality outcomes to occur more reliably for different kinds of students, working with different kinds of teachers, and different kinds of organizational contexts, well, that changes the question from what can work to how do we get things to work under a variety of different kinds of circumstances. And the goal we're after is how to get efficacy to occur reliably at scale, recognizing that students are different, the adults who work with students are different, the context in which this work is occurring, the organizational contexts vary, and all of these contribute to the outcomes we currently see. And so all of these things, in that sense, become targets for our attention. Okay, case example. One of the original big I3 grants was for this large randomized control trial of reading recovery. A little bit of background. Reading recovery has got, oh geez, I'm going to say now, it's about a 35-year history going back to Maury Clay in New Zealand. She was the founder of this work. And it was intentionally designed for first grade students who are at risk for not learning to read. So it's got a very specific population it's targeted for. And it's designed as a one-on-one intensive tutorial that students are exposed to. You're supposed to get about 50 sessions of this. And it sits within a comprehensive literacy framework. So that's kind of background to it. And so this was one of the big $40 million randomized control trials that the Institute of Education, that came out of I3, first round of I3. All right. Well, first year results produced an effect size of 0.7. This is a really big effect size in education. Most of the effect sizes in education tend to be around 0.2, I mean, if you find anything. So you see something this big, the immediate first thought is, well, let's go spread this thing. This is really big, okay? However, this study, to its credit, was done as a multi-site trial, so that within each school, some students are randomly assigned to reading recovery, and some students are not. And so you can essentially get a distribution of reading recovery effects across the 140 different schools in which this work was carried out. And when you look at the distribution in the effects, well, they really spread out. In fact, it turns out that the standard deviation in the effect sizes is almost as big as the average effect size. So the effects of this intervention seem to depend on the context in which it's introduced. There's a good 20% or so of the schools that had weak, or in some cases, maybe even slightly negative outcomes. It's an expensive intervention, so if this thing only had an effect size of like 0.15 or even 0.2, chances are you weren't going to buy it, because it's one of the more expensive things we can do. So you look at this, and if you're focused on variation in performance, the immediate questions you want to start asking are, what's going on here? Why is it that we're getting these kinds of results in about 20% of the schools? Might they have different kinds of students? Might it be, for example, that these schools have a very large proportion of English language learners and maybe reading recovery doesn't work so well? Reading recovery, another possibility is reading recovery is carried out through a highly trained teacher. You go through a whole year of preparation to do it. And well, maybe we're looking at variation in teacher quality, which might then back into how individuals are selected and prepared to actually do reading recovery. So that would be an entirely different possible reason why we're seeing this. Or there could be organizational explanations. It may very well be that well-trained reading recovery teachers aren't actually able to carry this out in some schools. And we'd seen this in some of the work we had done in Chicago, because if in schools that have chronic problems with teacher absenteeism, those schools also tend to have a very hard time getting substitute teachers. And so what do you do on those days when you don't have your regular teachers not there and your substitute teacher is not there? You take your quote-unquote freed people and you put them into classrooms. So you take your reading recovery teacher, you put her in the classrooms, and the students who are supposed to get reading recovery just don't get it. And that can happen really frequently. So there are lots of possible explanations. And this thinking about variation in performance says, well, we got it. Now we have to understand what seems to be driving these less than positive outcomes. And interestingly, the same is true at the other end. There are some places that seem to be getting almost double the effect sizes, what in the literature now people would refer to as positive deviance. There's somewhere out here, there's probably something really good going on. Well, what is it? What could we learn from this that might over time not only help us maybe solve some of this, but shift this whole distribution further to the right? And so I picked the reading recovery example because in one sense it's an extreme case because the average effect is so big, but there's no reason to believe that this kind of variation in performance is peculiar to this. This kind of variability in outcomes shows up, is likely to show up over and over again in educational interventions. And interestingly, it shows up over and over again in healthcare too. Anytime you have work that's carried out through complex organizations and the tasks that people engage in are complex, the natural consequence of that is wide variability in performance. That characterizes education. We've got very complex organizations in which teachers, principals, others work. The task we're asking people to do, especially the work of teachers nowadays, has become increasingly complex. I remember when I was in school, a common reading practice was round robin reading. Anybody here experience round? It's kind of, you had a book. We all had the same book, and I read a few sentences, and the student next to me read a few sentences, and so on. And if you misread something, the teacher would correct you, and it kind of went around the room, and you did this for a period of time. That's a fairly simple instructional task in terms of the cognitive demands on a teacher. Compare this to something like a guided reading lesson where, you have to figure out how to group students together for this guided reading lesson. So chances are you're using some sort of data for purposes of grouping students. You have to select an appropriate text given who the students are and who the objectives you hold for this group of students through that lesson. There's a pre-reading activity in getting students ready to read the text, so you have to understand what about the text and your students in order to prepare them to read. As the reading is actually going on, you're taking a running record where you're using a framework for identifying errors that students are engaged in, because that's going to be evidence for what you might do next. As this guided reading lesson comes to a close, there is an objective for that lesson that you want to make sure you've kind of pulled out for students, and you want to engage them in a comprehension conversation about the text they just read. That's a conceptually much more complex task. And I could tell that, I've told that story about reading, but I could say the same thing about what we envision now for mathematics instruction, science instruction. The work of teaching has become extraordinarily complex. You're going to get even more of this than we've seen in the past.